Welcome to this video, and we're going to talk today about the funeral. And of course, it's the one thing that happens in the church that nobody wants to happen, and we would prefer not to have any funerals at all, but that's unrealistic because people will always die, and then people will some people anyway, will need the church, and they will need prayers, and they will need the community to gather together to pray. So I'm going to go through the 7 stages now, first of all. There are 7 stages where the church or the priest or some minister gets involved when the person is dying. So when somebody is dying, the priest or somebody will give communion to that person as they are dying. Um, Maybe on a regular basis, maybe once a week, maybe more often than that. Maybe anoint the person, and when they're dying, the priest is often sent for, and the priest performs what's called the last rites, the last ceremonies, which are 3 sacraments really. There's the sacrament of the anointing of the sick, so the person gets anointed as they're dying. Now they can be anointed every month before they die as well, but they get anointed as they die, and then the priest will give them absolution. They may not be conscious enough to even make a confession or to say anything, so the priest will give them absolution and absolve them of their sins and whisper the act of sorrow into their ear sometimes if they don't seem to be conscious or whatever, and give them communion as well. It's called viaticum, food for the journey. So it's the last communion they receive. Sometimes it has to be a very small piece of communion because they mightn't be able to eat very much or they might be able to chew, and so it has to be a tiny little fragment, and that's given to them. And that's the last rites. Sometimes priests are called to do that at a road accident or some tragedy like that, or in somebody's house, and then in hospitals, chaplains do that. Priests give communion and give the last rites. They're nursing homes, as I say, the homes of people in the parish that the priest will visit. He's sometimes sent for when they're dying. So that's the first moment when people are involved, and it can be a minister of the Eucharist giving communion as well. The second one is when the body is about to leave somebody's house, or when the body is about to leave a funeral home and be taken to the church, or be taken to someone's actual home to be kept there. So prayers are said at that stage as well. And there's a name for that too. It's called gathering in the presence of the body. So people are coming sympathizing, and a priest will come or some other minister and say prayers before the body leaves the funeral home, or it could be a mortuary in a hospital. And sometimes it could be someone's home, and where the body is going to be brought to the church that evening. So we gather in the presence of the body, and it's the transfer of the body to the church or maybe to the person's own house for a while. And then there's another stage is when the body arrives at the church. Now, the body can arrive at the church in 2 different ways. The body can arrive at a church in the evening time. The reception of the remains occurs in the evening, and the funeral mass then usually occurs the next day. But sometimes people like to keep their loved one with them at home in the house for the evening, or maybe for 2 evenings if it was a tragic death or a young person or whatever. And so the body is not brought until just before the funeral mass. In either case, the body is received at the church. There's special prayers that are said. So if the body is brought to the church the evening before the funeral mass, there's a reasonably long ceremony where the body is blessed with holy water, and the body is brought up to the top, and the priest comes up with sometimes altar service or other people. Readings are done, and a psalm is read, a gospel is read. The priest may say a few words and say some intercessions, and a decade of the rosary. Mary is always prayed to, and there's a statue of Mary here. Mary is always prayed to at the end of all these funeral ceremonies. So that's the reception of the body. Sometimes the body doesn't arrive until just before the funeral mass. And then there's a much shortened form, a much reduced form of the reception, which might only consist of a prayer and putting holy water on the body, and then the funeral mass begins. Now, the next stage then is the funeral mass. So the funeral mass is the really big thing, and there's a lot of organizing goes into the funeral mass, and that's why I'm introducing this booklet here. This is a booklet which was prepared by the bishop, who's no longer with us now. Bishop Dempsey prepared that booklet. It's a booklet to be given people when somebody dies. So when somebody dies, the priest is informed, or somebody in the parish anyway, that the person has died and that the funeral mass is requested then, and the funeral ceremonies are being asked of the church and of the parish. The undertaker sometimes arranges that. He speaks to the priest, and then the priest and the undertaker and the family decide, oh, the body is coming in on Tuesday evening at 8 o'clock to the church, which will mean that the priest will have to go to the funeral home or to the home of the person before that to say prayers before it leaves. Then the body arrives at 8 o'clock and the reception of the remains prayers are said then. And of course, the funeral mass has to be planned then as well at some stage before it happens. So that's where this booklet comes into play. And this booklet consists of a number of readings. There are what's called Old Testament readings or first readings, and there's New Testament readings, which are the second readings. And here they are. There's a list of them in this booklet. Sometimes it depends, of course, from family to family. Sometimes a family will have only a few old people in it. Maybe the man who died had no children. Maybe his brothers had no children. Maybe his sisters had no children. There may be no young people at all. And the person organising the funeral is actually an older person. And then he has nobody to do those readings. Nobody from the family anyway. Now there are two options then. Readers that we have in the parish who read anyway are willing to do readings at a funeral. But sometimes the family don't even want that. They just want very few readings. And sometimes we just have one reading rather than two, because they can't get people to do a second one. Also, then we have prayers of the faithful, which are prayers for the person that died and for those who are ill and so on. And there's usually 5 or 6 of them. And sometimes we get people to say those, often members of the family. And if there's a lot of people in the family and young people and people willing to read, then it's no problem getting somebody to do each one of those. Sometimes you can only get one person and they have to do all of them. And occasionally the priest might have to do them if someone died who didn't have any relatives at all or whatever. So that's the prayers and the readings. There's another thing that people opt for, but it's optional. It doesn't have to happen, and that is the family decide to bring up symbols representing the woman or the man that died. For example, if he was a farmer, they might bring up a little model tractor. If he was a gardener, they might bring up flowers. If the woman was a cook, they might bring up some instrument or some thing that's used, maybe a cooking tray or a rolling pin or something representing cooking or baking. If somebody was a nurse, they might bring up some little watch that the nurse wore or whatever. Somebody was a doctor, they might bring the stethoscope. Somebody was a teacher, they might bring in a book from the classroom, a textbook or a school book or whatever. And depending on the job that the person did, whether it's a priest that dies, they often have a chalice, which the priest used the chalice every day to say mass. So whatever the person did for a living, some symbols are brought up representing the person, representing the job they did, sometimes representing their faith. The rosary beads might be brought up to represent the fact that this woman said the rosary or this man said the rosary all the time. It could be a candle representing their faith, the light of faith that they had. And some people might have enjoyed certain types of recreation. I've seen a pack of cards come up, or maybe a chessboard, or something that they enjoy doing as recreation, and that might be brought up as well. Often, and I see it nearly all the time now, a photograph of the person is brought up, and sometimes a photograph of the whole family is brought up and left. These things are left on a table at the front of the altar. So that's the symbols, and that's often done at the very beginning of the Mass, before it really starts at all. Another thing where the family get involved is there's a reflection, which is a little reflection, maybe a little poem, a little few thoughts, very well written, that's read at the end. A communion reflection. It's read after Holy Communion. That's another thing. If a member of the family gives out communion in another parish or another country or whatever, they're a Eucharistic minister, then sometimes they're invited to help distribute communion at the Mass. If the person who died had children or grandchildren that are serving Mass in the parish now, or serving Mass somewhere else, they often like to serve that funeral Mass for their relative or their grandparent or whoever it is. And sometimes families are very musical. We've had that here in this parish, very musical children, especially girls, but sometimes boys, and they will play music at the Mass for their aunt or their uncle or the grandparent or some cousin or whatever. And they will do all the music. But in most cases, families wouldn't be that musical, and the undertaker will provide somebody to do music and to come and sing and play the organ at the Mass. Occasionally the choir, our own choir, will sing, especially if the person who died is a member of the choir, or well known to them, or a relative of a member, whatever it is. So if the choir are available, sometimes they will sing at the Mass, but sometimes the organist we have isn't available and so on. So it all depends on circumstances. The sacristan in Glasser Church will have everything ready. In Callow we have a sacristy team. We have a team of people who work in the sacristy and who get everything ready, and they get everything ready the same as the sacristan that we have here in Glasser. So another thing that happens at a funeral is that somebody might like to say a few words about the person that died. It's usually described as a eulogy, so that's done at the very end as well of the funeral Mass. And sometimes people read a reflection then as well. So that's really a description of the funeral Mass and what's required. And this booklet here talks about that. And the prayer is said at the end of the funeral Mass. Now, a lot of funerals occur in the winter time, and winter time really means rain. So most funerals it's raining outside when the funeral is going on. So what we do in Calassar and other parishes have followed our lead. What we do is all the sympathising, all the shaking hands takes place after the Mass is over, and people are invited to shake hands with the family who are all sitting up at the front. And then there's prayers around the coffin, and the coffin is incensed and holy water is rubbed on the coffin as well. So that means that there's nobody standing outside in the rain shaking hands and everybody getting wet, and some older people, and they sometimes could get knocked down by the crowd of people that might be there. So to avoid all that, we do it in the comfort of the church, where people won't get wet and where the family are actually sitting down, and it's more easier for them. But now the funeral still isn't over, because the last coming to the end of the different ceremonies, one of the ones towards the end is the actual interment. Now, this can go in two different ways. Some people now opt to be cremated. So, if somebody opts to be cremated, then the body is taken away, and the interment of the ashes occurs later on. Sometimes it could be in a year's time. Sometimes it could be in a month. There's no set rule about that. When the ashes are ready, when the family are ready to go to a graveyard and inter the ashes, then the priest will come and say special prayers. And they're the prayers at the graveside, and they're said at that stage. So that's the interment of ashes. Now, the interment of a body in a coffin obviously takes place most of the time anyway, immediately after the funeral Mass. So the bob's going to the cemetery. It could be a wet day, everybody might get wet. So the priest or some other designated person says the prayers at the cemetery for the dead. And that's interment as well of the body. The special circumstances, the body sometimes is buried at sea as well. The church didn't approve of this. I'm not too sure how much they approve of it even now, but sometimes a person who was an admiral or a sailor or something like that requests to be buried at sea. And I think the church kind of reluctantly does that, but they would prefer the burial to take place obviously in what we call sacred ground, or consecrated ground, a graveyard or whatever. But that's the interment, and the prayers are said, and always concluding again with the prayer to the Blessed Virgin Mary, a decade of the Rosary, or the Hail Holy Queen, the Salve Regina as it's called. So that's the end of that ceremony in the graveyard. But there's two other moments as well, and the next one is the month's mind. Now this is a very Catholic thing. So in Ireland anyway, after a month, there's another Mass said for the person who died, and it's called the Month's Mind Mass. And it's just an ordinary Mass really, but some reference is made to the person who died, and there's the family are sympathised to, they're all named and sympathised to, and sympathy is expressed to them by the priest on behalf of the community. And that's known as the month's mind mass, which can be on a Sunday or at a weekend. Sometimes the family will offer to do the readings that day. We have readers that do those readings normally, but at the month's mind, sometimes the family will offer to do those readings and maybe to say special prayers of the faithful as well. And the very last thing in the funeral then, which really isn't the last thing, and I explain why, but it's one of the significant moments then after that, is the first anniversary. So when a person has been dead for a year, the family will book a first anniversary Mass. Now inevitably, or nearly always, that's going to be on a Saturday or a Sunday. And the Mass will be specifically said for that person who died. Sometimes the family will do the readings of that Mass, and sometimes they leave it to the readers that we normally have. Sometimes they do the prayers of the faithful, sometimes they don't, but that's up to the family. And sometimes some reference is made to that person who died, and a few words are said about them again. The homily, just to talk about the homily, at a funeral Mass, the priest will speak about the person that died. In order to be able to say something meaningful, the priest will usually meet with the family and ask them things about the person, to say about the person, which will be said then by the priest or whoever preaches at that Mass. And sometimes they're repeated again at the month's mind, and sometimes they're repeated again at the first anniversary. So that's a funeral. And of course, funerals come and go, and the priest forgets about the person after a while, whereas the family never forget. And the family will never forget the person, their loved one, and they mourn for them for a long time. And we've come to realise what grief is like more and more than we did. And people just don't get over grief quickly, and it can take a long time. And people mourn their loved one for the rest of their lives. And so the priest or somebody in the parish will visit that family after the person has died to offer some kind of comfort. And of course, there's also professional counselling as well for people who die, for the family of people who died tragically, or young people or whatever. And there's all kinds of help available as well for somebody mourning their loved one. And person needs to talk about it, and they need counselling in the sense that to be able to talk about what happened and talk about their loved one. And one of the great things that will happen is that you will probably cry when your loved one dies, and it's great to be able to cry. Tears are a great sign of healing, and it means that you're beginning to heal even as you cry. And so it doesn't look like that often early on, but tears are a big help. And so anybody who cries, never tell them not to cry. Just let them cry and encourage them to cry, because it's one of the best ways of healing from your grief. So that's a whole little talk about funerals. Nobody likes to have them. Nobody enjoys them. And yet the actual Mass and the celebration, it's a celebration because we believe in the resurrection of the dead. So the person, we believe, will enjoy happiness in heaven and will rise on the last day. So it's not all doom and gloom. We believe there's something beyond this life. And the Church constantly emphasizes that in all the prayers that are said and the ceremonies and everything. That's constantly emphasized. And at the funeral Mass, you have the Paschal candle, the really big candle that's always up beside the coffin, representing the resurrection. Jesus rose from the dead. We will rise with him. That's what we believe. So that's why that candle is lit as a sign of hope. And so death is not the end. Life, as it says here, life is changed, not ended. So it's not the end. And we believe it's something beyond death, eternal life, and the happiness of heaven. And the person in heaven is much happier than we could ever be here on earth. And there's two ways of explaining that. First of all, is that no matter what happiness we have had or will have in this world, it's only of limited intensity. People might say, oh, I'm so happy, or I'm very happy, or I'm really happy. But the amount of happiness is limited in this world. Whereas we believe that in heaven, the happiness is something way beyond what we could ever have here at any time. And so it's a much deeper happiness, a much greater happiness. But also, as well as being greater in intensity, we also believe the happiness in heaven is greater in duration. If we are happy here, we might be happy for an hour today, everything going well, and you're happy. But the way life is, with the ups and downs, the happiness we experience doesn't last. It fades, and something happens to upset us or whatever, and suddenly we're not happy anymore. But the thing about eternity is, and about being with God, we believe that's a happiness that goes on forever. So, from that point of view, there's a double advantage in that happiness. The duration of it is unlimited, and the intensity is so great. And quoting the scriptures, St. Paul said that no eye has seen or no ear has heard the great things that God has prepared for those who love Him. So the happiness is something we cannot, with our ears, we can't experience or understand, or neither with our eyes. We're not able to see or understand it really. So that's our great thing about eternal life and about heaven. So I suppose it's worth waiting for, it's worth looking forward to. And it's a great comfort to know that our loved ones are going to enjoy that. They're enjoying it already, and they will enjoy it more and more as time goes on. So we should be happy for them and celebrate their lives, celebrate what they've done, and be grateful to them for all they've given to us, and thank them. And priests will often thank the person for all the good that they did, because everybody does good, and some people do enormous amount of good. So a funeral mass, as well as being a sad moment to pray for the person that died, it's also a moment to thank God and to celebrate the person's life. And of course, the other aspect is to pray for the ones who are left behind, who are saddened. But all the ceremonies, all the different ceremonies I mentioned, offer comfort to the people who are there. And the community gather, especially in a place like Killassa and Callow. What's lovely about being here is that when someone dies, you suddenly realise that that person is part of a community. And you get so many people. Sometimes every single person in the parish will turn up to be there and to pray and to support. And we realise that we're all part of a great community and a part of God's family. And that's when God's family gather more than any other time is at a funeral, because we miss one of our own. And we're also happy that they're gone to God. So I think I've said enough now about that. But funerals are very special times, and a special time where we can renew our faith in God as well and in the resurrection. So thanks very much.